somewhere in a museum, or perhaps in a private vault, or catalogued under a number on a dusty page of a 12-volume compendium of ancient inscriptions. There is a bronze object, small enough to hold in one hand, cast from metal that was already old when Alexander the Great was born. 3 characters are engraved upon it, 3 characters. And buried inside those 3 characters, in the curve of a single stroke, in the ghost of a single ancient word, is the oldest known written form of the Chinese character for ship, chuan, a word for ship on a military instrument of war, belonging to a clan who trained under Confucius, fought the armies of Qi, and watched an empire collapse around them. How did the word for ship get there? To answer that question, we have to go back much further than the warring states of ancient China. We have to go back to the beginning. The oldest records of the Chinese people, the Shu Jing, the Book of Documents, one of the 5 classics of Chinese civilization, open with a memory of water. Not a river, not a season of rain. Waters that embraced the mountains and overtopped the hills. Waters that threatened the heavens. The Chinese did not borrow this memory from anyone. They carried it with them, eastward, across the steppe, across the mountains, across 5,000 miles of the ancient world. They carried it from the place where 8 people walked off a boat and looked out at a world that had been erased and reborn. 8 people. The number is not incidental, because the most ancient Chinese character for the word boat, chuan, was not constructed from nothing. It was constructed from memory. Scholars who have studied the original pictographic structure of that character have found 3 components locked inside it. Vessel, 8. People, 8 people in a vessel. That is not a coincidence. That is the memory of the flood, encoded in the writing system of a people who carried it east from Ararat and pressed it into bronze and bone and ink for 4,000 years. His name was Japheth, son of Noah, one of 8 survivors. Ancient historians called him the Great Migrator, the ancestor of the peoples who spread northward and eastward across the full breadth of the Eurasian world. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, made a specific and extraordinary identification. Japheth's son Magog, he wrote, founded the people the Greeks called Scythians, the nomadic empire that for 1,000 years dominated a steppe corridor stretching from the Black Sea to the borders of China. The Scythians, who became the Xiongnu, who so terrified the Han Chinese dynasty that an emperor ordered a wall built to hold them back. 4,000 miles of stone and earth. The Great Wall of China was built because of the descendants of Japheth, and the DNA inside every East Asian body on Earth, when measured at the empirically observed mutation rate, traces back to a severe genetic bottleneck approximately 4,500 years ago. 8 people. The number keeps returning. What you are about to watch is not a single argument. It is 5 independent bodies of evidence. Ancient historians, buried artifacts, the DNA inside living bodies, languages spoken from Tokyo to Jakarta, and flood traditions preserved across more than 200 distinct people groups across the Far East, all pointing in the same direction, one family, one origin. We will begin with the oldest document of human origins ever written. We will follow the Scythian migration corridor across 5,000 miles of archaeology. We will enter the genetics laboratory and read the migration route of Japheth's descendants in the bodies of 1 billion living East Asians. We will listen to the linguistic fingerprint left at Babel, still audible in the tonal languages of China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. And we will hear from the mouths of peoples who had no contact with the Near East for 3,000 years, the memory of a flood that covered the mountains. And we will come back to that bronze instrument, to those 3 characters, to a military clan on the banks of the Sai River in 475 BC, who pressed a new word into bronze at the very moment civilization was fracturing around them. The word for ship, the memory of 8 people on the water. 4,000 years of memory. This is where it leads. Look at a face. Look at the face of a grandmother in Tokyo. The face of a farmer in the fields of the Yangtze Valley. The face of a horseman on the Mongolian steppe. The face of a child in the Philippine highlands. Now look at an ancient text, one of the oldest ever written, that claims every one of those faces traces to a single man, a Near Eastern man, born in a world that no longer exists, somewhere near what is today the border of Turkey and Armenia. His name was Japheth, son of Noah, one of 8 survivors of the most catastrophic event in human history. And if the evidence we are about to examine is correct, then the ancestors of nearly half the population of the entire Earth walked off one boat, spoke one language, and spread to the uttermost ends of the Earth within a few hundred years. This is not a religious claim in search of evidence. This is 5 independent bodies of evidence, from ancient historians, from buried artifacts, from the DNA inside every East Asian body on Earth, from the languages spoken from Tokyo to Jakarta, and from the flood memories encoded in over 200 distinct people groups across the Far East, all pointing in exactly the same direction. One direction, one family, one origin. The 10th chapter of Genesis is one of the strangest documents in all of ancient literature. No other civilization on Earth produced anything like it. Not the Egyptians with their king lists. Not the Mesopotamians with their myths. Not the Greeks with their genealogies. No one else attempted what Genesis 10 attempts, a systematic record tracing every people group on Earth to a single ancestral family. These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations. And by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. Genesis 10:32, KJV 16:11. Scholars call this the Table of Nations. And whether you approach it as scripture or as ancient ethnography, its claims are extraordinary. It names 70 primary people groups, and modern ethnographers, archaeologists, and genetic scientists have spent 2 centuries testing those names against the historical and physical record. The results are remarkable. But to understand them, we need to start with 2 specific names on that list. Noah had 3 sons. Shem is the ancestor of the Semitic peoples, the Hebrews, the Arabs, the Assyrians. Ham is the ancestor of the African and Canaanite peoples. And Japheth is the great migrator, the progenitor of the peoples who spread northward and eastward across the full breadth of the Eurasian landmass. Japheth had 7 sons. And among those 7, 2 names stand out for anyone trying to trace the ancestry of the East Asian peoples. The first is Magog, the second is Togarma. Magog is the second son of Japheth. And in the 1st century AD, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, one of the most meticulous ancient ethnographers who ever lived, made a specific and consequential identification in his Antiquities of the Jews. Magog founded those that from him were named Magogites, but who are by the Greeks called Scythians. The Scythians, remember that name. Because what Josephus identified in the 1st century, the archaeological and genetic record would spend 2,000 years confirming. Togarma is the son of Gomer, grandson of Japheth. And both Josephus and the 5th century Armenian historian Moses of Corinth identify Togarma as the ancestor of the Turkic peoples. Not a theory, not an interpretation, an identification made by ancient scholars drawing on traditions and genealogies that were already ancient in their time. The House of Tograma of the North Quarters and all his bands. Ezekiel 38:6, KJV 1611. The North Quarters, in Hebrew, Yarket Dizafon, the uttermost parts of the North, Central Asia, the Mongolian steppe, the homeland of the Turkic and Mongolian peoples. Precisely. To understand why Josephus's identification is so consequential, you need to understand who the Scythians actually were. Not a minor, obscure people. Not a footnote in history. The Scythians were one of the dominant civilizations of the ancient world, a vast, nomadic empire that controlled a corridor stretching from the Black Sea all the way to Mongolia and Manchuria. A steppe corridor of 5,000 miles. The Greek historian Herodotus documented them extensively in the 5th century BC, describing their nomadic culture, their extraordinary horse mastery, and their dominion over the Great Plains of Central Asia. What Herodotus observed was the living legacy of Magog's descendants, spreading eastward, precisely as the Table of Nations records. And here is where the history becomes extraordinary, because the Scythians are not the endpoint of this story. They are the bridge. On their eastern frontier, the Scythians encountered, and eventually became, a people the Chinese called the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were the great nomadic empire that so terrified the Han Chinese dynasty that they built a wall to keep them out. A wall 4,000 miles long. The Great Wall of China was built because of the descendants of Magog. The Chinese historical records, particularly the Shiji, the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian, document the Xiongnu as coming from the northern steppes, the exact Scythian homeland. The Xiongnu are the direct ancestors of the Huns who swept westward under Attila and the Mongolian peoples who under Genghis Khan built the greatest land empire in human history. The genealogical chain is complete, and it is documented. Magog to Scythians, to Xiongnu, to Huns and Mongols, to modern Mongolian and Turkic peoples, to the broader East Asian world. But let us not stop with the Scythians, because the Chinese themselves preserved something remarkable in their own ancient records. The earliest Chinese historical texts, particularly the Shujing, the Book of Documents, one of the 5 classics of Chinese literature, open with an account of a catastrophic worldwide flood under Emperor Yao. The language used to describe this flood is not the language of a local river event. These are waters that embrace the mountains and overtop the hills, threatening the heavens with their floods. And the traditional dating of Emperor Yao? Approximately 2300 to 2200 BC. Precisely within the biblical post-flood period. The exact time frame when Noah's descendants were dispersing from Ararat. Even more striking, the earliest Chinese records preserve a tradition of the ancestors of the Chinese people migrating from the west, from the direction of Mesopotamia and Central Asia, a westward origin tradition. In the oldest Chinese historical memory, this is not folklore. This is the preserved directional memory of the Babel dispersal, carried eastward by the Japhethic ancestors of the Chinese people. And here is something that has no innocent explanation. Scholars of Chinese etymology, particularly C.H. Kang and Ethel Nelson in their documented research, have identified over 20 ancient Chinese pictographic characters that appear to encode specific memories of biblical events. Consider the ancient Chinese character for boat, chuan, chuan. It combines 3 elements, vessel, 8, and people. 8 people in a vessel. That is the precise number of survivors on Noah's Ark. Not 7, not 9, 8. The Chinese character for boat was constructed around the memory of 8 people in a vessel, before the Chinese had any contact with the Near Eastern world, before any possible borrowing of the Noah account from external sources. The character for forbidden or covet combines 2 trees and a woman, an echo of a garden, of a tree, of a choice that changed everything. These are not coincidences. They are not the product of parallel cultural development. They are the memories of real events encoded in the writing system of a people who were descended from those events, carried eastward from Babel, preserved in ink and brush for 4,000 years. In the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, the precise geographic crossroads between the Scythian world and the Mongolian world, archaeologists discovered something that should not exist. The Pazyryk burial mounds, dating to 500 to 300 BC. When researchers opened these mounds, they found preserved human remains showing a combination of facial features, partly Caucasoid, partly Mongoloid, not fully one or the other, both. A transitional population caught in the act of becoming East Asian. But that is not all they found. They found a specific artistic style, what archaeologists call the animal style, appearing simultaneously in the Pazyryk mounds and in early Chinese Zhou dynasty artifacts. The same artistic DNA. In the Siberian mountains and in China's earliest dynastic culture. At the same time, they also found horse riding equipment, saddles, bridles, the tools of nomadic horsemanship, identical to both Scythian Western sites and early Mongolian traditions. The Altai Mountains themselves are named in ancient Turkic tradition as the sacred origin point of the Turkic and Mongolian peoples. The archaeology and the tradition are telling the same story. If the Pazyryk culture shows the Scythian to Mongolian transition in the Altai, the Ordos culture shows what happened next. Archaeological finds in the Ordos region of Inner Mongolia, deep within what is now Chinese territory, reveal Scythian-style bronze artifacts dating to 700 to 200 BC. Not near the Scythian frontier, in China. Scythian artistic style, Scythian techniques, Scythian cultural DNA. In the heart of what would become the Chinese world. The animal-style art appears across the entire Scythian to Chinese corridor, from the Black Sea to the Yellow River. 5,000 miles of physical evidence. The footprint of Magog's descendants walking east. In recent decades, a new field of science has transformed our ability to trace ancient migrations, ancient DNA research, the extraction and sequencing of genetic material from ancient skeletal remains. And what ancient DNA is revealing about the Central Asian corridor is extraordinary. The Afanasyevo culture of the Altai region, dating to 3,300 to 2,500 BC, one of the earliest post-Babel cultures in Central Asia, shows a genetic profile that looks overwhelmingly Western Eurasian, Near Eastern, Proto-Caucasoid. These are the earliest migrants into Central Asia, and they look, genetically, more like a Near Eastern population than an East Asian one. Exactly what we would expect if Japheth's family began with a Near Eastern phenotype. Then the Andronovo and Sintashta cultures of 2100 to 1800 BC, later in the same corridor, show increasing admixture. The transition is happening. The genetics are shifting. And by the time of the Xiongnu Empire, 300 BC to 100 AD, ancient DNA shows a population that is predominantly East Asian in genetic profile. The transformation is essentially complete. Near Eastern ancestry, transitional Central Asian genetics, fully East Asian DNA, documented in the ancient bones of the people who made this journey. And there is one more category of archaeological evidence that deserves its own moment. Over 200 distinct people groups across the East Asian and Southeast Asian world preserve flood traditions. Not vague stories of rainy seasons, not local river floods, structured narratives with specific, shared elements. Divine judgment. A righteous survivor warned in advance. A vessel of preservation. Animals taken aboard. A mountain landing. Sacrifice after the waters recede. Post-flood repopulation of the entire Earth from a single surviving family. The Buryat Mongols of Siberia. The Ifugao of the Philippine Cordillera, one of the most geographically isolated peoples on Earth. The Iban Dayak of Borneo. The Hmong of Vietnam and southern China. The Batak of Sumatra. The Senoi and Temuan peoples of the Malay Peninsula. All of them, independent of each other, isolated from any possibility of mutual borrowing, all preserving the same structural narrative. The statistical probability of 200 independent people groups inventing the same specific multi-element narrative by coincidence is effectively zero. The only explanation that fits is the one Genesis has always offered. These are the memories of a real event, carried by real people to every corner of the earth they reached. Consider just one of these: the Hmong people of Vietnam and southern China. Their ancient flood tradition describes the entire earth covered with water. Two survivors preserved in a great wooden drum floating on the waters, landing on a mountain, becoming the progenitors of all humanity, a wooden drum instead of a wooden ark. But every structural element of the Noah narrative, divine judgment, vessel, preservation, mountain, repopulation, is present. Carried by a people who had no contact with the Near East for thousands of years after their ancestors left it. This is ancestral memory, not borrowed mythology, not cultural diffusion, memory of something their ancestors witnessed. Every human being on Earth carries, in every cell of their body, a record of where they came from. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child through every generation, accumulates changes over time at a measurable rate. Count the differences between two populations, divide by the rate of change, and you can calculate how long ago those populations shared a common ancestor. This is the molecular clock, and it is one of the most powerful tools in modern biology. What the molecular clock reveals, when properly calibrated, is one of the most remarkable findings in the history of genetics. Nathaniel T. Jameson, a geneticist with a PhD from Harvard, published a landmark work in 2022 titled Traced Human DNA's Big Surprise. His central finding: all human mitochondrial DNA traces back to a single ancestral population that experienced a severe genetic bottleneck. Not a gradual narrowing, a severe bottleneck. A moment where the entire human lineage passed through a tiny window. And when Jameson measured the empirically observed mutation rate, not the theoretically assumed rate, not the fossil calibrated rate, but the actual rate observed in real families across real generations, he found something mainstream genetics was not expecting. The bottleneck occurred approximately 4,500 years ago. 8 people, that is the bottleneck. And the DNA, when measured correctly, confirms it. Now let us look at what the Y chromosome reveals about East Asian ancestry specifically. Y chromosomes, passed from father to son,
carry haplogroup signatures, genetic markers that allow scientists to trace paternal lineages through time and geography. 3 haplogroups are of particular significance for the East Asian story. Haplogroup C is found at high frequencies in Mongolians, Koreans, Japanese, and indigenous peoples of East Asia and the Pacific. Its geographic distribution maps precisely onto the Geophytic migration corridor through the Eurasian steppe. Haplogroup D is found predominantly in Tibetans, the Ainu people of Japan, and Andaman Islanders. It represents one of the earliest eastward Geophytic migrations, among the oldest genetic signatures of the Eastern movement. And haplogroup O, the dominant haplogroup of Han Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, Vietnamese, and Southeast Asian populations, shows a radiation pattern from Central Asia eastward, precisely the Scythian Turkic migration corridor, precisely the territories of Magog and Togarmah. And here is the detail that seals the argument. When genetic scientists examine the Central Asian region, the Altai, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, they find that it functions as a genetic hub, a point of origin, a place from which East Asian populations radiated in every direction. Northeast into Mongolia, Manchuria, Korea, and Japan. Southeast into China, Vietnam, and Southeast Asia. East into the Pacific, reaching the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Even across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas. The same Central Asian hub that Josephus identified 2,000 years ago as the territory of Magog and Togarmah is what modern genetics identifies as the origin point of every East Asian population on Earth. But genetics has one more extraordinary revelation for this story. And it answers a question that has puzzled observers for centuries. If all East Asian peoples descend from Japheth, and Japheth was a Near Eastern man with a Near Eastern face, how did the distinctive East Asian facial morphology emerge? The epicanthic fold, the broader cheekbones, the flatter facial profile, the characteristic straight black hair. The answer lies in a single gene, called EDAR, ectodisplasin A receptor. Within this gene, a single point mutation, the V370A variant, changes one amino acid at one position in the protein, one letter in a 3 billion letter genome. And that one letter change produces thicker, straighter hair, shovel-shaped incisor teeth, changes in sweat gland density, potential contributions to flatter facial structure, multiple distinct traits. One genetic change. The shovel-shaped incisor is found at nearly 100% frequency in East Asian populations, less than 5% in European populations, less than 5% in African populations. One of the cleanest population markers in all of human biology. And the geographic distribution of the EDARV370A variant tells the migration story perfectly, 93 to 99% in Han Chinese and Japanese populations, 85 to 95% in Mongolians, 40 to 70% in Central Asian Turkic peoples, less than 5% in Near Eastern populations, highest in East Asia, decreasing through Central Asia, near zero in the Near East, a gradient that maps exactly onto the migration route from Babel to Beijing. And how quickly could one point mutation transform a Near Eastern phenotype into an East Asian one? Population genetics gives us a precise answer. If the founding group ancestral to East Asians carried the EDAR variant at even 10 to 20% frequency, the founder effect and genetic drift in a small, isolated population could drive it to near 100% within 15 to 20 generations, approximately 4 to 500 years. Within 500 years of leaving Babel, the founding population of what would become the Chinese, Korean, and Japanese peoples could have developed the full suite of East Asian physical traits. This is not evolution. This is the expression of genetic potential that was already encoded, waiting to be released when the right founding group reached the right environment. To understand how language connects the East Asian peoples to Japheth, we need to understand what actually happened at Babel. Not merely that languages became different, what that means at the neurological level. The human brain contains dedicated language architecture. Broca's area governs language production. Wernicke's area governs language comprehension. The arcuate fasciculus connects them. The angular gyrus governs written language. The primary auditory cortex processes the sounds of speech. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Genesis 11:7, KJV 16:11. The Hebrew word translated confound is balal, to mix, mingle, pour together in disorder. What God did at Babel was not merely give people new vocabularies. He rewrote the operating systems of their minds simultaneously. The sounds they could produce, the sounds they recognized as meaningful speech, the grammatical architecture by which they organized thought into language, their entire mental vocabulary, all of it, at once, for every person, simultaneously. And this explains one of the most striking patterns in human linguistics. In most languages, tone carries emotional meaning. A rising pitch signals a question. A falling pitch signals a statement. But the meaning of words themselves does not change with tone. In East Asian languages, tone is lexically distinctive. The same syllable in different pitches means completely different things. In Mandarin Chinese, the syllable ma, spoken in 4 different tones, means mother, hemp, horse, to scold. This is not a minor linguistic variation. This is a fundamentally different way of using the auditory system. Tonal language processing recruits different neural networks than non-tonal languages, specifically engaging the right hemisphere more extensively. And where are tonal languages concentrated on the world map? Southeast Asia, East Asia. The exact regions settled by the Japhethic groups, destined for the Eastern territories. The geographic clustering of tonal languages is not coincidence. It is the linguistic fingerprint of the Babel assignment. Specific language architectures given to specific family groups, who then migrated to specific territories. The Turkic language family provides the final linguistic confirmation of the Japhethic genealogy. Linguists have documented that Mongolian, Kazakh, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Uyghur, and a range of Central Asian languages all share a common Proto-Turkic ancestor. The Turkic-Mongolian linguistic connection is beyond scholarly dispute, and researchers studying the broader Altaic language hypothesis propose deeper connections linking Turkic, Mongolian, Tungusic, Korean, and Japanese. Whether or not the full Altaic hypothesis holds in every detail, the Turkic-Mongolian common ancestry is clear. It is the linguistic trail of Togarma's descendants, one tongue given at Babel, carried by one family group across the Mongolian steppe, becoming the language family from which Korean and Japanese eventually emerged. The linguistic trail follows the migration trail, which follows the genealogical trail, which follows the genetic trail, which follows the archaeological trail, all the way back to Togarma. back to Japheth, back to Noah. 5 independent bodies of evidence: history, archaeology, genetics, linguistics, flood memory. Each one, examined alone, is significant. Together they form a convergence that is difficult to dismiss. The Table of Nations names Magog and Togarmah as the Japhethic ancestors of the Eastern peoples. Ancient historians confirm it. The Scythian archaeological corridor documents the migration pathway. Ancient DNA reveals the Near Eastern to East Asian genetic transition in the bones of the people who made the journey. The EDAR gene maps the migration route in the bodies of 1 billion living East Asians. The tonal language clustering follows the Japhethic migration corridor. And over 200 flood traditions across the Japhethic world preserve the memory of the event that started it all. God hath made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds of their habitation. Acts 17:26, KJV 16:11. Every face in East Asia, Mongolian, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Filipino, Malay, Vietnamese, Indonesian, is the face of a descendant of Noah. Scattered by sovereign purpose, guided by appointed bounds, shaped by encoded genetic potential, carrying in their genes, their languages, and their oldest traditions the indelible memory of where they came from 8 people on an ark, to the full diversity of humanity across the face of the whole earth, in a few hundred years, by design. The extraordinary diversity you see in the faces of East Asia was never an accident. It was always the plan.